Can everyone see that now?
Yeah, it's good.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. All right, so this should be the screen that everyone can see now. Let me just do an auto adjust here. There we go. All right, so here's what I'm going to recommend that you guys do. I just kind of drew this on a piece of paper. And what it is it represents a timeline of the major political parties that you have to know, and we're going to kind of trace them from really 1787 all the way to 1932. So if you're doing this at home, let me just kind of show you what I would do. If you had a piece of paper, if you just take your notebook, and the only thing that you have to do right now to start is I would just draw two parallel lines like this, and then I would have one line come in here, out in your notebook, and if you just draw this shape in your notebook, you'll be fine. So that's really all I would do. I would draw this shape in your notebook, and then what I'll do is I'll walk you through how to add to that and basically timeline the development of political parties throughout our history, so that hopefully you have a better understanding of what's happening with these political parties, who's doing what at different time periods, how these political parties are changing over time. Because if you do get a political question on the day of the AP test, you are going to have to know this information. So if you just copy this into your notebook, that'd be great. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of show you how to turn this into this. And I'm going to even add some information to it. Okay?
Wait, hold up.
I'll go back. So copy this into a notebook or on a piece of blank paper horizontally. I'm going to try to show you how to turn this into a history of political parties. All right, so I'm going to bring my sheet over. Now remember, it's the exact same sheet. I've color-coded it to make it a little easier, but you can see the exact same movement that you just traced out is here in front of you. I just added all these extra things. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to guide you through each different era, and we're going to talk a little bit about what's going on. Okay, so the first thing I want you to do is I want you to start before the two lines that you made in this area right here. I want to just add a little kind of tab here, and the years we're talking about are 1787 to 1789. 1787 to 1789. Now we're starting at this time period because this is before political parties actually began. And we want to acknowledge that political parties start with the Constitution, but that doesn't mean that there wasn't political disagreements before the Constitution. And so 1787 to 1789 is the era of the development of the Constitution. And it's during this time period that we see the first two factions in the history of the United States. And those factions that developed during this time period are known as the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. Now, it is important to note that these are not parties. They're not parties. Parties seek to control the government. And at this time period, there was no government. There is only a debate over whether or not the Constitution should be the new system of the United States, new government in the United States. And so knowing these two groups, you have to understand that they're not fighting to control the government, but rather argue about the issue of the Constitution. So the Federalists are mainly the framers of the Constitution, as well as people who wanted to see a stronger central government. So these are people that were concerned that the articles were too weak. There were people like Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, George Washington, Benjamin Franklin, and they argued that the Constitution would be a better system of government. Now, the Anti-Federalists are people that worried that this new Constitution would be too powerful. And so they argued that while the Articles weren't great, this new Constitution went too far. And so they were more in favor of keeping the Articles of Confederation, and they were in favor of maybe amending it. When it was all said and done, we've got this major debate that by 1789 ends with the victory of the Federalists and the creation of the new Constitution. Now, that gets us into our actual timeline, the timeline of the United States. And this is where we're going to start to see the formation of the first political parties. So immediately, we start to see like political parties forming under the first presidency of the United States. I'm going to zoom in here a little. Under George Washington. All right, so the first parties form in our first era here, and our first era is going to go from 1790 to 1824. And in that time period, we see two major political parties forming, the Federalist Party and the Democratic Republicans. Now, these parties are formed over differences that are really arising from the French Revolution, as well as differences that are arriving over the power of the central government, and specifically, the finances, how we should deal with finances. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just write out kind of a comparison between the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans during this time period. Okay, so you might want to make notes of this as well. So I'm going to just zoom in a little. So let's talk about the Federalists versus the Democratic Republicans. So on one side, you've got the Federalists, and on the other side, you've got the Democratic Republicans, which I'm just going to shorten here as DR. So what are the biggest differences between them? Well, I said there's a number of issues that were separating these two original political parties. Obviously, the Federalists are the party of Alexander Hamilton, and so they tended to be more pro-British, because Britain was our greater trade partner and they wanted to stay out of the French Revolution. They wanted a stronger central government. They also tended to be pro-business, supporting Hamilton's financial plan, the whiskey tax, and so on. And they also finally had a loose interpretation of the Constitution. Okay, so that's the Federalists. Okay, and obviously, like I said, Alexander Hamilton was their main leader. The Democratic Republicans were led primarily by Thomas Jefferson, and they emerged in this first time period in direct opposition to the Federalists. And they had a very different interpretation of what the earliest government of the United States should look like. So in the French Revolution, they were pro-French. Thomas Jefferson thought that the United States should get involved and should support France because they had supported us during the American Revolution. They wanted a weak central government. More power to the states. We're going to see that in a number of things that I'll talk about in a second. They also were, instead of being pro-business, they supported and kind of propped up the small yeoman farmer. You remember, right? Jefferson believed that the farmer was the future of America. And lastly, we've got a stricter interpretation of the Constitution because, after all, a strict interpretation would mean a smaller government, a less powerful central government, okay? So these are the things that really kind of divided the Federalists and Democratic Republicans in this first era. And we see a number of different conflicts between 1790 and really in the 1810s. There's conflicts between them over a number of issues, including Hamilton's financial plan. There's debates over, obviously, the whiskey tax. There's debates over the Alien and Sedition Acts. Leading up to the War of 1812, they had different views on say, the Embargo Act, as well as other things. And so, like, these are the two major parties that are going back and forth in this first era. Now, the War of 1812 is super important to understanding this first era because the War of 1812 did something to this political system. The War of 1812 essentially helped eliminate the Federalist Party as a major party in the United States. Because if you remember right, the Federalist Party during the War of 1812 convened the Hartford Convention, and they talked about even as going as far as possibly seceding from the Union because they were unhappy with the fact that the War of 1812 was cutting off the United States from trade with Great Britain. Now, when the war ended, they looked unpatriotic for doing that. And so the Federalist Party really disappears in the aftermath of the War of 1812. And and as a result, we really see only one political party emerging over the course of the next 8 years or so. And during the Monroe Doctrine, we have something called the Era of Good Feelings, where it's just the Democratic Republicans who are in charge. And they become this dominating political force for this era leading up to the election of 1824. So that ends our first era. So in this first era, you only need to know the Federalists, the Democratic Republicans. Who are they? What do they believe? Okay, those are the things that are separating them. Okay, now we get into our second era. I'm going to move this a little forward here. Okay, our second era is between 1824 and 1854. Okay, what defines this second era in American political history? Well, let's talk a little bit about what causes this split. Now, the cause of the split in political parties after the Era of Good Feelings is really the election of 1824. Now, for those that don't remember the election of 1824, it is sometimes referred to as the Krupp bargain. This is when Henry Clay, John Quincy Adams, Andrew Jackson all ran for the presidency. No one got a majority of the electoral votes, and so the election was thrown to the House of Representatives. And in that election, Henry Clay makes a deal to make John Quincy Adams the president, and in return, he becomes the Secretary of State. And in doing so, they shut Andrew Jackson out of the presidency. Okay? So this is a big deal because essentially you have the Democratic Republicans dividing between the followers of Henry Clay, who become the Whigs, and you've got the followers of Andrew Jackson, who become the Democrats. So we've got in the second era two really new political parties that we need to know, the Whigs and the Democrats. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the differences between these two, and you're going to find they actually are very similar to the old Federalists and the old Democratic Republicans. So let's go through and let's just kind of compare the two during this era. All right, so I'm going to put Whigs over here, Whigs, and then I'm going to put Democrats on this side. Okay, hopefully that's enough room. Okay, so let's talk about what is the differences between the two. So the Whigs are very similar to the Federalists in that they wanted a strong central government. And they also tended to be pro-business, just like the old Federalists. Okay, so that's one way in which way like the Whigs were defined. During this time period, they favored the Second National Bank, I don't know, hopefully we can see that. I know it's not the clearest. Let me see if I can try to zoom in and make this a little clearer. Hopefully. Okay. During this time period, they favored the Second National Bank. They also favored the American system. They were for the American system, which was the system that was created by Henry Clay. So that makes sense. And they also wanted internal improvements. Roads, canals, that kind of thing. Okay, and internal improvements were something that a lot of people who were in favor of states' rights opposed. So it's going to make sense the Democrats didn't like that issue. So let's talk a little bit about the Democrats under Andrew Jackson. So the Whigs kind of look like the old Federalist Party. The Democrats during this time period are in favor of states' rights. So they think that states are more powerful. Some Democrats, like John C. Calhoun, would even go as far as to say that the states have the right to nullify laws. Very similar to the old Democratic Republicans. They kind of like promoted the small yeoman farmer. But they actually even went a little farther than that. They also started to talk about the importance of the common man. So Andrew Jackson himself was like pushed forth this idea that any American could do any job, and that you didn't have to necessarily own land or have a lot of education in order to be able to maybe contribute to society. Some of the issues that they stood for is they wanted to eliminate the national bank, because they saw it as a elitist institution. In addition to that, they also wanted no internal improvements, and they were more likely to favor westward expansion. So I'm running out of room here. So I'm going to put they were in favor of westward expansion. But note for yourself that they also opposed internal improvements because they thought that was a threat to states' rights. All right, so these are the big issues that are dominating this time period. And we can see this, if we go, I'm going to zoom out a little. There we go, okay. In this second era, we see this in a number of different issues. Obviously, we've got these things playing out with the Jackson's veto of the national bank. We also see this with the because they were pro-business, the Whigs tended to support tariffs, whereas Democrats opposed them, and of course that led to standoffs like the Tariff of Abomination and the nullification crisis that was in the 1830s. Because Democrats tended to be supporters of farmers, the Democratic Party also drew a lot of support from the South, and there's going to be kind of changes between these two parties over the issue of slavery as that issue becomes more important in society. And that's going to take us into our third major era, which we can see right here, our third era, which is really between 1854 and 1896. So let me kind of explain. Hold on one second. Let's see. So let me kind of explain to you a little bit about what kind of defines this third era between 1846 and so on. Let me just sit here. So going back over here so you can see the whole thing. By 1854, the Kansas-Nebraska Act took place, and there had been a number of different third parties that had popped up in the 1830s and the 1840s, some of them more important than others. For example, in the 1840s, with the growth of immigrants that were coming in, you've got the Know Nothing Party that's coming. In the 1830s, as the abolitionist movement starts to gain momentum, we got the Liberty Party that's calling for the complete and total abolition of slaves. We also see something called the Moderate Party that's emerging. And the Moderate Party, I'm sorry, not the Moderate Party, the Free Soil Party. The Free Soil Party is a more moderate party. And the Free Soil Party emerges in the 1840s with the goal of stopping the spread of slavery. We see a great example of the Free Soil Party is the Wilmot Proviso, which was added to the declaration of war at the start of the Mexican-American War. And what David Wilmot, the author of that document, said was he wanted to ban slavery from any land that was acquired as a result of the Mexican-American War. So this is an example of the Free Soil Party and how there was this growing movement by a lot of people to stop slavery from expanding into new places. Now, that's not to say that they wanted to eliminate it completely, but they just want to try to kind of quarantine it hoping that that would kind of allow slavery to die out gradually. Well, what ends up happening around after 1854 with the Kansas-Nebraska Act, as it's becoming more clear that like this issue of slavery in Western territories is really becoming a divisive issue, is you see the Whig Party merging with some of these other groups, specifically the Free Soil Party, to create a new party known as the Republicans. And this party is not only pro-business, like the Whigs are, but they're also in like trying to stop the spread of slavery moving forward. And so this kind of creates a new era that is going to last us from the Kansas-Nebraska Act all the way through the election of 1896. So let's talk about like what we need to know about this new era. Okay. Let's see, I'm going to run out of room here, but what do you need to know about the Republicans versus the Democrats in this time period? So Republicans versus Democrats. Okay. So in this third era, the things that define the Republicans versus the Democrats is that Republicans are going to want, as we have already talked about, strong central government, whereas the Democrats are going to favor states' rights. Okay, and they're going to make, like the Republicans want the federal government to come in and I'm going to zoom in on this here. The Republicans want the government to come in and stop the spread of slavery, where Democrats are going to argue, especially in the South, that it is the states' rights to choose whether or not to have slavery or not, and that the states can even, if they want, nullify or even secede from the Union. The Republicans are still going to be pro-business. That's from their Whig background, whereas the Democratic Party is going to be like representing the interest of farmers, but increasingly they're going to be representing the interests of slaveholders in the South who want to protect slavery. They're also going to see, obviously, a big differences on like the views of slavery. So the Republican Party is going to become the anti-slavery party, whereas the Democratic Party wants to maintain that institution. And like the Democrats argued that either it should be kept completely, or like some people like Stephen Douglas, who was a Northern Democrat, argued that it should be solved with popular sovereignty. So this takes us to the beginning of, or the end of the start of our third era. But the third era isn't over. So this will take us into the Civil War, which is an important event. But obviously this goes beyond that. So what we're going to do is we're going to move over to our second part of this. And what I want you to do is I want you to take some notes. Take the next sheet out. And I want you to just draw 2 straight lines down to extend your timeline. So what we're going to do is we're going to pick up where we left off, and I'm going to try to explain how these political parties continued in each of these eras. And so we're still in the same era. We're in the third era, but obviously things are going to change after the Civil War is over. So I just want to go through that with you together. And all you just have to do in your notes is draw these 2 lines, and we'll start going through it. So let's begin by like just putting an end at the beginning here, the end of the Civil War. So the Civil War lasted from 1861 to 1865. It was fought over those issues that we just talked about that separated these political parties. You've got, obviously, a big issue was the morality of slavery, and whether or not slavery should be allowed to expand and grow into new territories. The Republicans argued that it shouldn't. that it should remain where it is, and abolitionists argued that it should even be completely eliminated, whereas Democrats said that it should be able to be spread anywhere, or at the very least we should use popular sovereignty to determine what areas would have slaves and what areas would be free. In addition to that, there's also arguments over states' rights, which we see worked out from the Civil War. And obviously, the federal government, the power of the federal government is being promoted by the Republicans. They think our government should be stronger, whereas a lot of Democrats are arguing, especially Southern Democrats, that states are more powerful than the federal government and can nullify federal laws. So like these issues, as well as others, are going to lead to the Civil War. When the Civil War is over, there are still issues that remain that define this third period between the Democrats and the Republicans. So let's talk about what that is. In the aftermath of the Civil War, we have an era of Reconstruction from 1865 to 1877, in which the United States is trying to figure out how it's going to rebuild itself after the war is over, because of so much of the country's been destroyed. And it's this issue of how do you bring the country back together. And then there's, after that, between 1877 and 1901, there's the Gilded Age emerging, in which we really start to see Second Industrial Revolution kind of ramping up. So this time period is defined by Reconstruction, the Gilded Age, and let's also not forget this idea of the Second Industrial Revolution, in which the United States is going from a largely agricultural society to all of a sudden now a industrial society, where we're going from a country where a majority of Americans made their living on farms to all of a sudden a majority of Americans making their living in a factory. Okay, and that's a huge change. So what do we need to know about the differences between Republicans and Democrats in this era? Well, as before, there are some consistencies. So let's go through those. Republicans here, Democrats over here. So the pro-business, pro-agriculture is going to be a consistent part of these two political parties. So the Republicans are going to be pro-business, whereas the Democrats are going to remain largely for farmers. But they also start to emerge as the group for the working class. Okay, so that is that's one thing that kind of defines these two during this era. The Republicans want a stronger central government. That's there's a continuity. And we see that with, like, for example, Reconstruction. So the Republicans want the federal government to basically rebuild the South and kind of remake them. And the central government under the Republicans in Reconstruction becomes basically a force for establishing new rights that didn't exist before this time period, giving African Americans not only ending slavery, but giving them citizenship, and then giving them the right to vote. Establishing the Freedmen's Bureau in order to set up educational programs, redistributing land. So like there was a push for stronger central government, especially by radical Republicans. They're also pushing for protective tariffs and the government, like the building of the Transcontinental Railroad and other things like that. You've got the Democrats during this time period still advocating for states' rights. In fact, they resent to a high degree the Republican influence in the South after the Civil War. And that's going to be a major source of conflict. The Republicans in the aftermath of the in the aftermath of the Civil War are going to look to expand citizenship, specifically of African Americans, as we see them pushing for African American like voting rights, obviously granting citizenship to African Americans in the form of the 14th Amendment. whereas the Democrats, who are primarily located in the South, want to try to restrict this expansion of citizenship, especially to African Americans, and they see that as a threat to their own power. So they're going to be fighting to stop the expansion of that citizenship. Now, who supports which of these different groups? That's something for us to kind of keep in mind. So the Republicans at this time period would have been mainly Northerners, immigrants, and African Americans. At this time period, Democrats are more likely to be in the West, and also, and this is an important term, the Solid South, which refers to like that old, like the South that it, like the coalition of Southern states that still was kind of committed to states' rights prior to the Civil War, and were fighting against some of the reforms that were happening after the Civil War was over during the period of Reconstruction and into the Gilded Age. Okay, now this is going to define these political parties during like this third era, but that's going to start to change again by 1896. So by the end of this time period, you can kind of see this clash between Republicans and Democrats over a number of issues. And probably at the beginning of this time period, the clash is primarily over like the power of government and the expansion of citizenship to African Americans. But as we enter into the Gilded Age, that conflict becomes more about this issue of pro-business on one side, in this case the Republicans, and maybe I should, sorry, write that down. This is the Republicans. More. And then the more pro-working class, that is the Democrats. So the Republicans, if you remember right, represent business. So they're in favor of like large corporations. They support laissez-faire. They support the growth of the railroads. They want tariffs, and they feel like that business should be the drivers of the United States. The Democrats are going to support more farmers, and they're wary of the growth of big business, especially after Reconstruction in the Gilded Age. And we see that some important third parties emerge during this time period. One of the most important is the Populist Party, who we can see right here. And the Populist Party is created to really be concerned over like the growing influence of railroads, and especially their influence over farmers. And so the Populist Party by 1896 merges with the Democratic Party. And we have this election in 1896 that kind of brings these issues to a head. Business on one side with the Republicans versus the working class and farmers on the other side. Now, in the election of 1896, it's McKinley, who's the Republican candidate, versus William Jennings Bryan, who is the Democratic candidate. It pits business and urban America, represented by the Republicans, versus farmers and workers, represented by the Democrats, against one another. And in that election, the Republicans win. McKinley becomes the president in the election of 1896, and this signals a change or a major shift in power in the United States from rural America, which had traditionally been the Democratic Party, to urban and industrial America, which is now the Republican Party. And we see that in our fourth era. So in our fourth era lasts from 1896. Let me pull that down here. Change that. Okay. Good. 1896 to 1932. Now this era is dominated by Republicans. And it's also like an era of some other key events that are going to be important, which is the Progressive Era primarily, World War the Roaring '20s, and it'll take us all the way through, like, really the start of the Great Depression. So what do we need to know about political parties during this time period in the progressive era? Well, let's kind of hash it out right here. Okay. So on the one hand, you've got the Republicans. Put this right here so we can see. Okay. Good. So we got one hand, we got the Republicans, and on the other hand, we've got the Democrats. Okay, so what defines them? Now, I told you that the Republicans are going to dominate this time period, and the Republicans are important because they're more likely to embrace, in this time period, progressivism. Okay, Teddy Roosevelt is the president who turns progressivism into a national movement. When he becomes the president after the death of McKinley in 1901, his square deal is what kind of makes progressivism something that is national. They're going to be more urban and pro-business, as they have been. And they're going to be the more liberal of the two parties during this time period, which obviously conflicts with the way that we view Republicans and Democrats today. But they're also going to be the more imperialist of the two parties. So because they're pro-business, they're going to be pushing more for the United States to take an active role overseas. And so foreign policy is starting to become a bigger issue when we start to define the Republicans versus the Democrats. Let's keep going. Now, how does the Democrats kind of compare to that? Well, the Democrats are still pro-farmer and also pro-working class. Okay. In addition to that, they're going to be slower. They do embrace progressivism because this is just a progressive time period. So they're slower to embrace progressivism. But we do have a Democratic progressive president during this time period, Woodrow Wilson, who does accomplish a few progressive things, including the Clayton Antitrust Act and the establishment of the Federal Reserve. There we go. It's a little bit better. We also start to see like continued support from the Solid South. And they're more likely to be anti-imperialist. Okay, so if William Jennings Bryan, for example, was a leading anti-imperialist, and he was the Secretary of State under Woodrow Wilson, who was a Democrat. Now, it is important to understand that the progressive era doesn't last the entire time. And by the, I'm going to zoom out here. By the end of this time period, in the 1920s, some of the progressive views that both parties had are starting to give way to more of a kind of a laissez-faire feeling. And that takes us into the start of the Depression. The stock market hits in 1929. And then by 1932, you've got the election of FDR. The election of FDR represents a new era of political parties. And it's really 1932. I'm only going to take this to 1945 because that's all you need to know. We're going to stop our understanding of political parties there because nothing beyond 1945 is going to be on the test. But you need to know that FDR, his election, completely reshaped these political parties. You know, notice that prior to this time period, prior to 1932, the Democrats were the more conservative party for at least about 100 years. in American history. They're the more conservative party here in the progressive era. You go back to this era after the Civil War, they're more conservative as well. They're trying to stop the changes in citizenship. What FDR is going to do is he's going to kind of reshape that, and he's going to turn the Democratic Party into the Liberal Party, which is how we still view it today. Okay, so let's try to get some information down about how FDR changes it. Okay, so FDR establishes something called the New Deal, and the New Deal creates a new political alignment that you guys need to be aware of. So I'm going to try to do this to the best of my ability, given the fact that we don't have a lot of space here. Okay, so I'm going to just go Republicans over here and Democrats over here. Okay, so the first thing is some things don't change. So Republicans are still going to be pro-business, pro-biz, and Democrats are still going to be in favor of, let me zoom in here, still going to be for more farming and workers. So that's not going to change, okay? But here's where we are going to see a big change. Republicans after 1932 are going to want to decrease the size of government. They want a smaller government, whereas the Democrats tend to become the supporters of increased size of government, which is how it is today. That all comes from the New Deal. The New Deal is a Democratic program. And in the New Deal, FDR is creating all these different reforms to try to deal with the Great Depression. Establishment of organizations like the WPA, the NRA, the FDIC, Social Security, and the CCC, all these different programs that we've talked about. And so the Democratic Party becomes the party of larger government, whereas the Republican Party becomes the party of smaller government during this time period. The Republicans, because they're pro-business, want less government regulation, whereas the Democrats want more government regulation. So the Democrats are arguing that we need to regulate the stock market. We need to regulate the banks, whereas Republicans want less of those things because that kind of coincides with their pro-business stance. What ends up happening is in the aftermath of, trying to make some space here, in the aftermath of the Great Depression, this group tends to become more isolationist before leading up to World War II. And they also tend to become more conservative. Now, I'm running out of space here, so I'll just kind of list off some of the things that you need to know about the Democrats. You can write this down. So what's interesting about the Democrats is they want to increase the size and power of government, which is something that they hadn't wanted to do before. And in addition to that, they create a new coalition, and you should know this. So I will write this down. There's the New Deal coalition that is established by FDR. And what it does is it links the old Solid South that had traditionally been supporters of the Democratic Party, but then it flips African Americans who had traditionally voted for Republican to the Democratic Party. Because the Democratic Party under the New Deal is offering like programs and opportunities for African Americans that the Republican Party wasn't offering. And so like that kind of creates this new coalition of working class, the Solid South, African Americans, and liberals all under the Democratic Party under the New Deal. And this is going to become the way that the Democrats and Republicans are configured all the way up through 1945. All right, so that is a history of political parties. There we go. And before I move on to my next topic, I'm going to Hold on one second.